Alright, so finally I finished Dark Souls 3 in its entirety. It took me a fucking while though. After almost 113 hours played, many excruciating deaths, hours of mindless soul farming and wandering about, falling off ledges, I finally beat the game. Over 2 years late though. Now I know what you're gonna say. You think Dark Souls 3 is hard? Play Dark Souls 1 blindfolded with no hands, and no volume, and no TV, and the only weapon you can use is the dung pie. Wait until you play Demon Souls with no eyes or mouth. That's the true definition of hard, you fucking idiot. Yeah, I think you kind of get my point, actually. Looking back at the script there, I wrote so fucking much for that. I don't even know what that was. But the point of today's video isn't to discuss the difficulty of Dark Souls 3, because frankly, every Dark Souls video on this whole fucking website always sucks Dark Souls dick because the game is difficult. Yeah, fair enough, it was a challenge, but that's not what we're discussing today. This video is more about the beauty of Dark Souls 3 as a whole, as cliche as that sounds. The game, in my opinion, is the epitome of the Dark Souls series. It has a polish that no other of the Dark Souls games possesses. Every single boss is impressive, all of the environments are beautifully crafted, all of the regular enemies are unique and have stunning animations, and all of the weapons and armor are clearly meticulously designed to Dark Souls' very particular art style. On the whole, this game is fucking beautiful, and it's still an immense experience 2 years after its initial release. Dark Souls 3 really has aged like a fine wine. Dark Souls 3 is by far the most polished of the Souls games. Don't get me wrong, I've been really enjoying playing through Dark Souls 1 recently. However, the whole experience of Dark Souls 3 was just a lot more put together, which I suppose is to be expected considering it's the third game in the franchise and FromSoft had the experience of 4 previous games under their belt. But this previous experience is what made Dark Souls 3 such a well-rounded game for me. It was my first Souls game, and I suppose it sort of set the precedent for what I expected from a Souls game. So I went back and played Dark Souls 1. It just didn't have the same fine-tuning that Dark Souls 3 does. The combat is smoother, the environments are way more detailed, and the bosses seem to be designed in a much less bullshit way, if you get what I mean. Dark Souls 1 is great, and the overall experience is very similar to Dark Souls 3. However, I just prefer the overall more streamlined experience of Dark Souls 3. I know, crucify me if you want, I know lots of people hold Dark Souls 1 very dearly to their heart, but to be honest, I think Dark Souls 3 is just overall a better game. Something that I think Dark Souls 3 almost perfected was the design of the playable areas. Not only do they add to the dark, gloomy atmosphere of the game, but they're also designed in a really clever way. It feels like you're in a classic dungeon crawler with modern RPG and action-adventure features. When you're roaming around the various areas, you feel as if you're hopeless, because there are enemies attacking you left and right and center without yielding. And the actual graphical design of each area with low-lit dungeons or dead forests conveys the feeling of complete isolation, and I think it's beautiful that this was able to be conveyed so well simply by the design of the different sections of the game. It's a mixture of excellent level design in terms of playability and in terms of how it looks cosmetically. Something I think the earlier game Souls lacked in heavily was the latter. They were developed for older hardware with more limited technology, meaning that the areas didn't necessarily look good, although they were designed in a similar way to the areas in Dark Souls 3 in terms of playability, which just shows that the experience of 4 Souls games prior to Dark Souls 3 did wonders for the game. They could focus on the cosmetics of the game more, opposed to trying to design levels that were challenging for the player. One area that I think is beautiful in Dark Souls 3 is Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. The shades of dark blue in the sky and the towering stone structure of the city look amazing from a distance. It's almost picturesque. I think Lothric Castle was also another breathtaking area in the game, which is a complete contrast to Irithyll. I just love the almost gothic fantasy look of the castle's many spires, which is something that is very common in the Souls games. FromSoft definitely know how to design nice looking playable areas. The overall polish of Dark Souls 3 doesn't end with just how it looks either. The actual gameplay is much more streamlined and fast paced than previous Souls games, which I happen to prefer. Yeah, it's not the hack and slash sort of hectic gameplay of Bloodborne, but it's definitely way more fast paced than the earlier Souls games, which I think makes for a more interesting combat. You're not sitting there with your shield up in a corridor trying to kill a single knight. You're usually pitted against multiple enemies that relentlessly attack you, forcing you to constantly have your wits about you, forcing you to constantly be on edge. Or maybe this could be attributed to my preferred playstyle, which is basically pick up the biggest fucking sword you can and smack it about until everyone is fucked. It did work pretty well for me though. The combat just works better in Dark Souls 3 and it seems less rigid than earlier games. Dodging felt more fluent and using an Estus flask no longer caused you to stop moving completely, which I think helps the combat feel a whole lot more energetic than it did in previous games, which I personally much prefer. The game also kept true to the upgrading system that has been present in every previous entry in the series, although it was toned down and simplified slightly. I suppose to make it more accessible to new players, because let's be honest, the upgrading and menus in Dark Souls 1 are daunting as fuck for a new player. I don't know what it is about it all, but it seems so confusing. I got to grips with the upgrading system in 3 much more quickly than I did in 1, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. There was a certain satisfaction even when upgrading a weapon in Dark Souls 1 because everything was so confusing and new to me, whereas in 3 it seemed as if it had been toned down more. No special quests or objectives to craft a certain weapon, you just upgrade with Titanite shards. But it didn't really take away from the game as a whole, just made it more accessible to me in the first place, to be honest. In fact, this level of polish and accessibility is what drew me towards Dark Souls 3 in the first place. I always saw the Souls games as immensely complex and just too difficult for me to understand. And Dark Souls 3 was the perfect way for me to ease into this genre of game. I think it's a great game for newcomers, which is probably why I enjoyed it so much. I think the bosses are the highlight of any Dark Souls game. They're what everyone's looking forward to when a new one is announced, and with good reason. The bosses in Dark Souls 3 are unlike any other bosses I've faced in previous games. Prior to playing Dark Souls, my favourite boss battles were from games like Kingdom Hearts or God of War, but Dark Souls just has the best bosses by far, especially Dark Souls 3. There's not one boss that I didn't enjoy. Except for maybe the Deacons of the Deep, but we don't talk about that boss. It was pretty fucking abysmal, to be honest. Each boss has a fucking beautiful soundtrack that increases the intensity of every encounter tenfold. Even the starting bosses have great themes, but one in particular that jumps out to me is the soundtrack for Prince Lorien and Prince Lothric. It's reminiscent of one of my favourite bosses in any game, the Lingering Will from Kingdom Hearts 2. They both have a very similar violin melody that plays throughout it, and I can't help but really enjoy this piece of music. Another boss battle that has fantastic music is the Soul of Cinder. Now I know that long-time fans of the Dark Souls franchise love this piece of music because it samples Gwyn's boss theme from Dark Souls 1. It seems quite fitting, however, considering the Soul of Cinder was intended to be the last final boss of the Dark Souls series. So calling back to the first final boss of Dark Souls, and then from a lore standpoint the first being to Link the Flame, was a really nice touch, and even though I haven't been playing Dark Souls since the beginning, I respect the callback a lot. This shows just how much time and effort FromSoft put into their games, not just from a design standpoint, but also from a musical standpoint. Most people forget about music in games, so it's nice to see such a well-crafted soundtrack in Dark Souls 3. Like seriously, another amazing piece of music is the Nameless King's theme. The music is fucking beautiful. It perfectly mixes with the hecticness of the boss and the beauty of the boss arena that you're in. Like, you're literally fighting this dude on a big fucking cloud. Anyway, from the Cemetery of Ash all the way to the Kiln of the First Flame, all of the boss battle music is absolutely fantastic. They're all so unique and perfectly complement the fights themselves. On top of the amazing music, the boss battles are superb from a design standpoint. Yeah, they've got their fair share of glitches and cheeses, but on the whole, the bosses were really well designed. The bosses themselves are so impressive. Their designs are fucking immaculate. A few bosses that I think look great are Pontiff Sullivan, the Abyss Watchers, the Dancer, the Nameless King, Osiris, Prince Lorien and Prince Lothric, Soul of Cinder, Father Ariandel and Frida, and finally Slave Knight Gale. These ones jumped out at me because they're so striking, from the way they look cosmetically to how they're actually designed. You can see the effort the art team went into when designing these bosses. Dark Souls has always had interesting looking bosses, but I think Dark Souls 3's bosses are among some of the best. One of my favourite fights in the whole game is the two princes. I just love the soundtrack, the slashing of Lorien's sword, and how easily the fight flows when dodging his attacks. Not gonna lie, I had some trouble with this boss for whatever reason, but I ended up getting really good at dodging all of his attacks, and it was just a great payoff. Learning Lorien's attack patterns and being able to dodge him perfectly just felt great. Had a similar experience experience with the Nameless King, I had a really hard time with him at first. He even completely one-shot me at some point, but eventually I just got better and better at dodging his attacks, knowing when it was a good time to attack or to hang back, and managing my stamina so I could always roll away if I needed to. I managed to straight up 4-hit the dragon and then finish off the Nameless King with relative ease. Not gonna lie though, he did fuck me to pieces time and time again for like 3 hours. The bosses in Dark Souls 3 are just so impressive. That's the best way I can describe them. Each of them have a uniqueness that is refreshing as fuck. A lot of games have the same old bosses that are completely predictable. And fair enough, yeah, there have been games recently that have had some superb boss battles, but none of them have anything on Dark Souls 3. These bosses are by far the most enjoyable, the most challenging, and the most rewarding bosses I've ever had the pleasure of defeating. Honestly, FromSoft are absolute geniuses when it comes to boss design. The overall design of Dark Souls 3 is also great. We've already talked about the world design and boss design of the game, there's no point going over those again, but Dark Souls has always been a mechanically impressive game. The various weapons and armor in the game do not only look good, but they all have a variety of different movesets and animations depending on how you use them. For example, I mainly use great axes and ultra great swords for the majority of my playthrough, and these had different weapon arts than say a katana. The same can be said for the various armor sets in the game, apart from the fact that they don't really have any special abilities. They just look different. Most armor sets look really fucking good, and some look absolutely ridiculous. But I suppose that's just how games are for some reason. Weapons also require different skills to use. With a heavy weapon like the Fume Ultra Greatsword, you need 50 fucking strength, which is ridiculous. I picked the heaviest sword in the entire game to use, and I swear to god my equip load was like 120 by the end of the game. Anyway, a Greatsword will have vastly different skill requirements to a standard straight sword that I was using at the beginning of the game. I really like the skill system in Dark Souls 3. It gives the players a chance to really craft their own build, even if it does require a lot of farming to do so. I picked a heavy armor, heavy weapon build, which probably wasn't the wisest given the fact I had to increase my equip load by so much, but it does show that it's a very versatile upgrading system because it perfectly supported my playstyle. I'm usually a heavy armored, heavy weapon using warrior in video games where the choice is available, so it was nice to be able to really customize the way I played the game. It meant that my own experience in the game is completely different to someone who took, say, a sorcery route, but to be honest, sorceries did jack shit, so why anyone picks sorcery is beyond me. Anyways, the skill system in Dark Souls 3 is fantastic. It's simple, but it works really well. No skill trees or flashy animations when you level up, just stats, and I really like this simplicity. The final thing I want to talk about is the enemies in the game. We've already discussed the bosses and they're great, but the normal enemies in the game also deserve some praise. Never have I seen a game with such a wide variety of enemy designs and archetypes. Most games make a specific set of enemies and recycle them as the game progresses, possibly reskinning them as your environment shifts. However, Dark Souls has always had such unique enemies. Enemies that are area specific, enemies that have different animations and sound effects, enemies that do varying amounts of damage and drop different items. Dark Souls 3 has some of the most impressive enemy types I've seen in any video game. They range all the way from skilled knights trained in medieval combat, patrolling the walls of Lothric Castle, to terrible beasts that can be found only in the darkest depths of the land of Lothric. Each enemy has a very distinct moveset, and the design of the enemy usually gives a good indication as to how they'll perform in a fight. This allows you to gauge how you should go about attacking, although sometimes you get some enemies that look small and harmless, but they fuck you up. I'm telling you, that they fuck you up completely, and you lost tens of thousands of souls, and you sit there wondering how you got fucked up by what's effectively a small man in a hat. On the whole, I don't know if this video can even do Dark Souls 3 justice. I know I'm like 2 years late to the release of this game, but I just had to tell everyone how fucking amazing it is. More people need to experience Dark Souls. It's seriously an amazing series. All the way from the customization, to the combat, to the bosses, and even the playable areas. Dark Souls 3 was an absolute pleasure to play from start to finish. It's one of the best games I've played recently. It really has aged like a fine wine.